Okay, Jim, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me for the Inclusion Dialogue podcast. You are somebody that I have been seeking to have this chat with for quite some time. And I really appreciate you giving up the time this morning for you and this evening for me to have a chat about all things inclusive and special education. Would it be okay with you if I asked you how you got into this field and how you ended up, what shaped your views on special and inclusive education?
Yes, that's entirely appropriate. Um, I got into the field almost by accident, and it had to do with my anti-war sentiment. The fact was that I did an undergraduate degree in elementary education, general education, and finished that degree in 3.5 years. So I taught general education one semester. And then I was faced with a choice. This was in the early 1960s, 1962. At that time, the Vietnam War was going on, I guess. It was just starting. And I was raised in a religious culture that was opposed to military service. So here I was, 21, 22 years old, with a degree in elementary education, a semester teaching experience. And I would never have been drafted. The United States had a draft at that time, so people would be drafted into the military. I was married, and they weren't taking married people at that time. But I wanted to volunteer to do some service to my country. Mm-hmm. And under the law at that time, you could appeal for a conscientious objector classification, a 1O classification, to the military. So I appealed for that. I went before the local board, and they said, okay, you can do this. Then it was up to me to find a job. Mm. I was living in northern Indiana, and to do this alternative to military service, I had to take a job somewhere else in the country. So that I couldn't stay living where I was. So I thought, well, I have a degree in teaching. I have some experience as a teacher. I'll apply for teaching jobs. So among them were teaching on Indian reservations, and there was a job teaching emotionally disturbed children at the Menninger Clinic's children's division called the Southard School in Topeka, Kansas. So to make a long story short, I applied for that job. I was hired by a man named Richard J. Whalen to teach emotionally disturbed kids in this residential institution in Topeka, Kansas. I took that job. I left after 2 years, not because I was unhappy with the job, but because I could make more money teaching in regular public schools. So I taught special ed for a year in a regular public school. Meanwhile, Richard Whalen had resigned as principal of the Southern School and gone to the University of Kansas and done his doctoral work there and become chair of special ed at the University of Kansas. So after a year of teaching special education in a self-contained class, which was probably the first one in Kansas, I went back to general education, taught regular sixth grade. And the following year, taught fifth and sixth graders and was a principal in a different school. Meanwhile, I had finished a master's degree in teaching in the elementary school. And the people who advised me in that program recommended me for scholarships in various schools in PhD programs. Mm-hmm. One of those was Vanderbilt University, and I considered that, but I accepted an Anderson Fellowship in the philosophy of education at New York University and had planned to go there. So I had accepted and received the fellowship, planned to go, but I got a call from Richard J. Whalen, who said, well, yeah, you might go to NYU in philosophy, but I want you to come to Kansas City, where I direct the program at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and I want you to interview with me and Ogden Lindsley, who was then part of the program. And so I went to Kansas City with the intention of going to New York City. And I was convinced by Richard Whalen to join the special ed program there. So I wrote to NYU and said, well, I'm sorry, but I'm not coming after all. I took the fellowship at the University of Kansas in special ed, and I was sort of unusual in that I had experience teaching general ed and special ed. And long story short, I finished the program there. Dick Whalen became my advisor. And I should say the late Dick Whalen, because unfortunately he passed away after heart surgery. But his influence was very great on me. So I then finished a doctoral program at the University of Kansas, taught special ed at the university level 1 year at Illinois State University, and then was recruited to the University of Virginia, where I remained for the rest of my career.
Interesting. That's a really good story. Yeah, very good. Yeah. And I like the kind of accidental part, but what's for you won't pass you, really. It's one of those things, isn't it?
Yeah, well, so people have written about adventitious events and the way they shape lives. And I think that's true of mine.
Yeah, certainly. Can I ask you a little bit about your research work since then? So you have, a huge amount of research covered over what, I think globally could be considered a time of huge change in how we, our attitudes towards people with, say, disabilities or additional learning needs or whatever vocabulary we want to put on that. And how your research has developed, parallel to those maybe more legislative and policy changes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that has interested me a lot is the history of the field, and I've done some work in that area. One of the reasons I became interested in that is that I was, in my early years at the University of Virginia, a consultant at Western State Hospital, which opened in the 1840s as Western Lunatic Asylum.
Wow.
And I got into the library there and found volume 1, number 1 of the American Journal of Insanity, which later became the American Journal of Psychiatry. And I was just fascinated by the reports of people working with the mentally ill in the 19th century. And one of the first papers I published on history was published in the Journal of Special Education in 1976, I believe. So I've continued to have a real interest in history and policy and the way public policy gets shaped. Dick Whalen had a very important influence on me in looking at those things. Of course, in the era in which I worked with him, Public Law 94-142, which was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, had not yet been passed. So I finished my doctoral work in 1969. That gives you some idea about how old I am. And the public law was not passed until 1975. So there was a lot of interest in what made the law the way it is, and why were certain things included in it that are really important. And I may be getting off the track of my own research here, but the law was really important. The primary emphasis of the law was free and appropriate public education. By the way, I know Ed Martin, whose 2013 book called Breakthrough is really important. It's like the history of legislation and how the law came to be. So free, appropriate public education was important. FAPE, or FAPE, it's called. Is important because rich people always have a choice. They can buy whatever they want. The people who depend on public education face a very different situation. They are stuck with whatever public education provides. So that free meant at no cost to parents. Public is part of the public education system. Appropriate means, well, it's attuned to the needs of the individual child. Education means, well, it's not something else. It's education, which implies instruction. So the law focuses on that FAPE idea, free, appropriate public education. And it says, well, you have to have, for each child identified as having a disability, this individual education plan. Some people call it individualized. I think in the law, it's really individual education plan, or IEP. So you have to think about what you're going to teach this kid. What does the child already know? What are you going to teach him? How are you going to do that? So it said you have to do that. You have to have an IEP, and you have to pursue that IEP in the least restrictive environment, or LRE, which is where inclusion comes in, because there is a bias toward not restricting the child more than necessary. But, and this is something I think many people have tended to forget, you choose that LRE from a CAP. The CAP stands for Continuum of Alternative Placements. So you have this continuum ranging from the most restrictive, apparently, the most restrictive in some people's minds anyway, hospital, schools, institutions, special classes, resource rooms, general education. So you have this range of things to choose from, a range of alternative placements.
Yeah.
My feeling, and I'm writing a paper about this right now with my wife, who was my PhD advisee, and another PhD advisee of mine, about LRE and hard choices. If you have a CAP, a continuum of alternative placements, then LRE demands hard choices. If you go to the inclusion only or full inclusion or inclusive only education, as some would have it, then you say essentially to people, hey, I've saved you a difficult decision. I've made it for you. You don't have to decide anything. The decision is made for you. Now, I think most teachers and parents would not like that if they understood what is called for by the law. I'm talking about the United States law now. Of course, there's the United Nations law, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I think goes back to 2006, I believe. Yep. And Demetrius Anastasio, who's at Southern Illinois University, a frequent co-author of mine, and a guy named Mike Gregory, who's at Harvard Law School. The three of us collaborated on a chapter for a law book, which addresses Article 24 of the CRPD. Article 24 is about education. It mentions full inclusion as the goal. It does not define full inclusion, nor does it mention special education. So there are some of us who are fearful, and I'm not afraid to admit to being fearful, that the idea of special ed will get lost in the, I suppose you could call it a fetish for full inclusion. The idea that, as a guy named Frank Lasky, a lawyer who should know better, said in a chapter published in 1991, all decisions about placement should be focused on the regular neighborhood school and class. So the LRE, which he said is a pliable concept. Yes, it is. It should be. He said it's a pliable concept, so we don't want it. Focus everything on inclusion. So this has been said for a long time. I mean, 1991 was, 30 years ago? So it's been a long time. My feeling is that special educators have lost an important focus on instruction. Instruction and its effects should come first. The idea of place should come second. But, there has been tremendous confusion about civil rights and the law and special education for many, many years.
Yeah.
In fact, soon after the law was passed in 1975, Bill and Susan Steinbach, who, by the way, got their degrees at the University of Virginia, talked about merging special and general education as if that would be desirable. There was little opposition to that. And then they said in 1991, the first article they published was 1984, I think. And in a book published in 1991, they wrote about how in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, that was about racial segregation, the court said that separate is inherently unequal. And so they said, well, separate is always unequal. Mm. And that's the rationale for placing children with disabilities in general education. And people have expounded on that. And what I think people forget is that Brown versus Board of Education addressed one thing, and that was the place of instruction. And it addressed only one difference, and that was difference in color or heritage or race, whatever you want to call it. It involved the racial segregation of schools. It had nothing whatever to do with disability. Disability is a different kind of difference. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I suppose relative to the other interviewees on this podcast, I suppose what I'd say is your voice is it's seemingly the minority voice in terms of the academic perspective on this inclusion dialogue, if you like. So you're kind of swimming against the tide. Would that be fair in terms of the general sentiment is that full inclusion is positive? And obviously we have, as you mentioned, the UNCRPD really driving that. And in many national contexts, Ireland included, scrambling to fulfill its obligations. When you mentioned instruction there and the importance of instruction for special educators, as devil's advocate to you, can I not just say that, you know, if general classroom teachers are equipped and have the capacity to provide for students with disabilities I guess you're going to get into the type of disability at some point here, aren't you? But, you know, is that not the optimum situation?
If every teacher were a polymath, yes, of course. If every teacher were competent in teaching every single thing, of course. Yeah. But that's like, let me explain to you that's like saying every lawyer should know every aspect of every law, criminal or civil. It's like saying every pilot should be able to fly every plane, no exceptions. It's like saying every physician should treat every illness or whatever physicians treat, illness or disability or anything. It'd be like saying every builder should be able to build everything. Every truck driver should be able to drive, or every driver should be able to drive every vehicle. It is not in the realm of possibility. Children, let's say with deafness, deserve to have a teacher who is fluent in sign language. The idea that every teacher is going to be fluent in signing is so preposterous that you think, wait a minute, or every teacher should be competent in Braille. Are you kidding me? I mean, well, Yes, of course. If the teacher is competent to teach. Here's the problem. Some teachers who teach general education are competent to teach some children with disabilities. Not all teachers are, and not all teachers are competent to teach all children with disabilities, regardless of the nature or severity of that disability. So it's a matter of judgment, of the real world judgment of what are we faced with here? What do we want here? Now, if you want the body to be in the right place, which, according to full inclusionists, is the general education environment, if that is the most important thing, then yes, certainly every child should be included. One of the things that I find really preposterous is this notion that disability is just another form of diversity. It's like skin color or religion or heritage or age or any other disability, any other diversity that you could name.
Yeah.
No, disability is a particularly education relevant diversity. It matters what the kid knows and what the kid can do. That matters more than the place the child is. Now, but here's another thing. Of course, you need to think about the purposes of schools. Why do we have them? Is it merely socialization? No, not really. It's more than that. Schools have to do with learning. You can have inclusion of people with disabilities, including children with disabilities, in activities other than education. But education is special in that it is focused on what you want kids to know, what you want them to be able to do. It is not just being there. If being there is the thing, cool. Do full inclusion. If it's more than being there, then consider where else might this happen? Now, I know Roger Slee has a very low regard, apparently, for Margaret Warnock. But I think Warnock came to understand that the important thing about including kids is that they be included in learning. Not that they be under the same roof at the same time with everybody else. That is a fool's proposition. The reason we want kids to go to school is to learn stuff, not just to be there. You can make education more difficult by giving teachers groups to teach that are more diverse in learning. The diversity in a lot of things doesn't matter. Age, weight, height. But what the kids know and what the kids need to learn. Well, the more diverse the group in that respect, the more difficult it is to teach. Suppose you or I were to try to teach special ed to randomly chosen individuals. We'd have a hell of a time.
Mm.
And what I think a lot of people don't understand is you can make education so difficult, most people are going to flee. They are not going to even want to do it. You can make education so difficult that nobody can do it. How can you do that? Well, forget all the other kinds of diversity, but give them a group to teach that is extremely diverse in what they know and need to learn. Yeah, you can make education impossibly difficult. And I think, from my perspective, having been a teacher, being married to a teacher, actually having been married to teachers, my late wife was a special ed teacher. My current wife taught special ed for 25 years. Knowing sort of what it's like and what is required of teachers, full inclusion, meaning bodily inclusion of all children, is just, it's a mindless sort of fetish. If teachers are to have a fetish, it should be learning, not place. But yes, I'm a minority voice. Yeah, everything is trending against me.
Yeah, it's a minority voice. I agree with you, but I suspect that it is in the academic circles. But perhaps my experience here in Ireland would be that these voices are very present on the ground, particularly in classrooms. So and I talk a lot about that policy practice kind of disconnect and how it needs to trickle down. I won't keep you much longer, Jim. But okay. Can I finish by just asking, what would you like to see?
What would I like to see?
Yeah.
I would like to see inclusion be really important, but not the most important thing. So I would like to see a renewed commitment to the continuum of alternative placements with the difficult decisions being made of where this child is best taught on an individual basis, not precluding those difficult choices. I think inclusionists become their own worst enemies by insisting that it is for all. We tried that in other social policies in the United States and elsewhere. Like we said, no, you can't drink alcohol, period. That was the period of Prohibition. And people figured out, oh, I see, that gives, what happens here is it just goes underground. And rich people are always going to have their choices. Poor people are going to drink things that kill them. And so Prohibition was reversed. I think people have experimented with abortion, and we're toying with that in the United States. You're saying, no, you never do it. You just never do it. Period. It's not a choice you have. It's not a choice you can make. Well, what happens then, it goes underground.
Yeah.
And rich people always get what they want. They can fly to Europe. They can fly anywhere where abortion is legal. They can cover it up. They can do a lot of things that poor people can't. And I think one of the things that people should consider about public policy has to do with economic justice. And what you don't want to do is make things inaccessible to people of limited means.
Yeah.
To me, that's what we're on the verge of with full inclusion and special ed. Rich people can hire tutors. They can send their child to a special school. They can have a teacher for their own kids. They can do anything. Now, if public policy means, hey, you have no choice, it's inclusion. You take what the teacher can offer. Special school for you, special class for you, resource room for you, not an option. We have one option only here, and that means no choice. That means you go to general ed. Now, some people are trying to say, oh, well, general education, well, it'll have tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. To me, that sounds like tracking by another name. Now, I'm not against tracking. I think it makes sense to have groups that are not extremely diverse in their learning needs and what they know and need to learn. So that's one way of getting around it, is saying, oh, yeah, they're in general ed. Special ed doesn't exist. Roger Slee would probably like that. He wants to talk about inclusion education only. I and an international group of co-authors, including Gary Hornby, people from Germany, Portugal, Greece, have a chapter in a volume of which Roger Slee is the editor. It's called Inclusive Education. We said, well, we think it would be good if you called it inclusive and special ed, and didn't want to do that. It's like special ed is no. General ed is the promised land for everybody. It's preposterous, but it's an infectious idea.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the conversation isn't going to go away anytime soon.
No, it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And probably, here's what I think is likely to happen. Full inclusionists will win. In another, I don't know, 30, 50, 100 years, who knows how long, special ed will be reinvented. People will figure out, oh, let's see, there are these kids who are blind, who are deaf, who are mobility impaired, who have learning disabilities, who are mentally retarded or have intellectual disabilities, who have psychiatric problems. And they're not being very well treated in this system of general education. But I think inclusion is going to win. I think it shouldn't, but I think it will. It's sort of like voting rights in America. I think we should make it easier to vote, but a lot of people don't think that. They're concerned about election security, which is a legitimate concern, but probably not the most important one.
Okay, that was really interesting, Jim. I think it's, I said it was the minority voice, but I think it's an important voice to be heard. So I'm really delighted that that your contribution is going to be one of this series. And I think it's important that people can hear that as well as you have described it here today. Do you have anything you'd like to finish on?
Again, Friday, I'm going to talk to the Illinois State CEC, Council for Exceptional Children, about inclusion. And the title of my presentation is The Importance of Inclusion. I think inclusion is important. It's important not to run it in the ground. It's important not to wreck it by assuming that it is the most important thing or the only thing.
Yeah.
So yes, I think all children should be included who can be successfully. The idea that they can all be included successfully is, I think, preposterous on its face.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We'll leave it there. And thanks for that contribution. Cheers, James.
Thank you.